How's the EU mobilising private funds to plug this gap of almost 180 billion euros a year to meet the Paris Agreement goals?
Well, we are currently working towards an action plan on sustainable finance, which we are going to present in March, following the final report of high-level expert group, which we said exactly to work on this part of sustainable finance. Without prejudging the results, there are a number of directions where we work on non-financial disclosures, so on transparency for investors as regards sustainability, on defining green investment, so in a sense in defining the EU taxonomy on green and sustainable investment, where we can then potentially attach also EU labels and green bonds and other initiatives to this. And also we're assessing the case for adjusting the capital requirements for banks which are doing lending to the green and sustainable goals. So this is a broad set of measures on which we are currently working.
Are you confident you can plug that gap, the gap I mentioned of almost 180 billion euros? Are you confident that gap can be plugged?
Well, we are aware that this gap cannot be covered by public finance only, but we believe it's certainly within the vast capacity of our financial system, because our asset managers, institutional investors, are managing around 35 trillion euros of assets in EU. So it certainly should be within the capacity of our financial sector. So the question is how we are actually diverting and steering the private finance towards green and sustainable goals.
Commissioner, if I can move on to MiFID II, because there's so much to chat to you about, and you recently warned that some EU member states were late in adopting MiFID II. What would it mean for market participants if one or more countries were late in transposing the MiFID II directive?
Indeed, we had been highlighting and also alerting the responsible governments, responsible finance ministers on the deadline to transpose MiFID II before it enters into force on 3rd of January. So clearly now it's still a couple of weeks to go, so we should concentrate to ensure that the transposition of MiFID II is actually finalize exactly to avoid potential negative consequences if MiFID II would not be transposed, which could also result in some inconveniences or potentially even some disruptions for market participants.
Yeah, can you talk about those disruptions? I mean, how would it affect businesses? How should supervisors react if one or more countries are late to implementing the MiFID II directive?
Well, of course, primarily it concerns trading obligation and trades transparency. So that's what the most could be affected is potentially trade in certain classes of shares. We are now, of course, working closely with European supervisory authorities, also with national competitive authorities to ensure as smooth transition as possible. So now we should concentrate on actually transposing the MiFID II, and then, if necessary, we would be ready to mitigate the consequences together with supervisory authorities.
Commissioner, I want to ask you about Brexit, because Liam Fox, who you'll know, the Trade Secretary here, he said overnight that the UK would like a trading relationship with the EU after it leaves the bloc that, I quote, is virtually identical to the one it has now. How realistic is that, a trade deal that's virtually identical to the one that the two parties enjoy now?
I would say we are moving towards discussing those issues, but we are not there yet. Currently, as you know, European Commission has concluded that there is a sufficient progress in a first set of negotiations and a first set of issues, but it's still to be confirmed by EU summit later this month before we can move to the next stages of negotiations, which will also cover our trade relations.
Are you concerned at all, Commissioner, by the sounds coming from the UK since that Friday breakthrough? I mean, there seemed to be a little bit of backtracking from various parties here in the UK. Were you concerned at all by the sounds coming out of the UK after that big moment on Friday?
Well, we have reached an agreement, and of course we expect that we stick with this agreement, and this is the basis on which we will be reporting sufficient progress to the Council later this month. And we are confident that this will provide us with a good basis actually to move forward to the next stages of our negotiations.
Commissioner, last week we had a big Basel III announcement, but the standards, the Basel Committee standards, don't bind on banks, of course, until they're actually enshrined in national rules. That's going to take years. That means the process opens the door to further changes. What changes are possible?
First of all, I would highlight that from the EU side, we are committed to transpose the Basel Agreement, and we'll be working on this. But of course, we'll be starting our work with a throughout impact assessment and public consultation, because we now need to see the exact picture how the Basel Agreement is potentially affecting banking sector in Europe, and then we'll be working on transposition measures. And I would also say that certainly our intention is to make full use of the transitional arrangements also as regards the output floors. So we intend to use all the transitional arrangements until 2027.
Commissioner, given that you're overseeing financial stability, I thought I'd throw in a question on Bitcoin, because naturally it's a hot topic right now. I mean, A, does it present any financial stability concerns? And I mean, how close an eye are you keeping on Bitcoin futures? And I mean, do you have a view on whether it's a bubble or not?
Well, there have been already some announcements for European supervisory authorities indicating the highly speculative nature of investment in virtual currencies, which of course clearly also holds to the Bitcoin.